Welcome to the Off the Charts football podcast brought to you by SIS. This is a Matt Manocherian-less podcast this week. He and Bryce Rossler are off at the Combine. I'm here with James Weaver, who's normally here with me on this show, and we're going to talk about a competition that we sponsored last week, which is the Syracuse Football Analytics Blitz. And we're going to talk to the winning team from the University of Pennsylvania. But first, James, what is, if you had to pick a Combine event that you participated in, what would be your Combine?
I like watching the gauntlet, the receiver gauntlet going back, when receivers looking back and forth. Obviously, there's a big opportunity for embarrassment of getting hit in the head and something like that and not looking at the right direction.
Which one would you do?
I would do the gauntlet. I would do
Really?
It. I think
so
I'd be.
You want the embarrassment?
I think I would embarrass myself less there than running the 40-yard dash. So
fair enough. I was thinking that I would choose the weighing event because I feel like I can stand still on a scale pretty good.
That's a good one. Yeah. That is a good one.
That's as good as I can really offer. Okay, so the people that we have here are the team from Penn, and I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves first before we get to sort of talking about their winning performance. So go ahead, guys.
I'll just get started. I'm Daniel Coale. I'm a junior majoring in business analytics and management in Wharton.
I'm Caleb Cannon. I'm also a junior majoring in economics.
Yeah, I'm Krish Shah. I'm also a junior majoring in stat, finance, and CS.
I'm Ezra Troy. I'm also a junior and I'm majoring in economics as well.
I'm Sam Pasco. I'm a junior as well. I studied communications with a statistics minor.
I will admit that I am definitely biased in favor of the person who's majoring in communications and minoring in statistics because I majored in psychology and minored in math and stat. So, that's the real path. All right, so just to sort of introduce the case involved, basically there are a whole bunch of different schools participating, some schools with multiple teams, and the case was using data presented from SIS, which had play-by-play data with a whole bunch of charting data elements, and also some additional player value stuff and some contract stuff. And we asked, what are the traits that make a good defensive lineman? How does a defensive scheme, 3-4, 4-3, that sort of thing, change your analysis? What are the traits that make a good defensive line overall, which is more of like a sort of qualitative assessment? And given salary constraints and based on the sort of way that you value players, create an optimal defensive line. So first, I guess, if you guys could just give a rundown in brief of what you did throughout the project to sort of come to your conclusions.
So I guess one of our first results that we saw were that faster and lighter players, whether they're linebackers, defensive ends, or even interior defensive linemen, they were better pass rushers than the heavier players. There wasn't really much of a run correlation to being better defending the run as to weight and speed. And this is really generally because of technique is what we posited.
So from that initial conclusion, how did that sort of inform what else you did?
Yeah, so after we kind of had that idea, our general idea is we want to value the defensive line as more than kind of the sum of the individual players, but how those players will work together in certain down and distance situations. So in order to do that, we kind of knowing that there's some physical explanation, but also maybe where you're playing, and then, something kind of unexplained about run defense. We're going to cluster players. So kind of group these players together based on their physical attributes, the percentage of time they're playing in each different technique, and also explicitly on the pass and run defense performance. And then we kind of modeled basically in any game state, depending on which kind of grouping of players you have. So maybe you have two kind of faster guys, two kind of slower guys, maybe a more traditional 4-3 with a traditional 3-4. As you group those players together, what's kind of the excess EPA that you generate in each game state? And once we had that idea, we kind of optimized for the line combination that would give us the best EPA over those predicted game states. And then we maximize the player talent based on the situations for which they would be playing in. One
of the big reasons that we chose your team, and to be fair, I was one of the judges involved. And also, to be fair, I'm currently wearing a Penn sweatshirt, so I'm slightly, I was not biased, but I was pleased in some sense. So one of the big reasons we chose your team was your explanation of how situational factors contribute. So what went into, and that was not part of the prompt, right? We wanted you to think about however you wanted to think about the value of a defensive line and how you might construct it. But one of the big things that you presented was, here's how we'd set up the line in third and short. Here's how we'd set up the line in third and long, run situations, pass situations, that sort of thing. What went into the decision to include that as like a sort of primary part of the analysis?
When we were thinking about the problem, we realized that different situations in football are very unique in that in different times during the game and in different down and distance and score situations, there's just completely different defensive lines and defensive shifts and kind of personnel that you want on the field. So kind of one of our first thoughts was thinking about how not only would we kind of pick the best 4 players and then kind of pick a substitute, but really pick defensive linemen that would A, work well together, but B, kind of pick a group of 5 or 6 linemen that we could substitute in pretty easily with, kind of with them being able to augment each other's strengths and fill in any weaknesses when necessary. So it was kind of a key point in our analysis was breaking down the data into different game states and optimizing for each of those game states and then picking players from there, as opposed to just, trying to pick the best 4 and then throwing in a couple players at the end, but really it came from our top-down approach of thinking about the line as a whole and not trying to think of players on an individual level.
So you guys had mentioned earlier about, and I heard modeling, heard clustering. So I wanted to get a little bit into the nitty gritty and what analytical techniques did you guys use and how did you guys settle on choosing to implement those ones? And then it's kind of a follow-up question. What were some of the selection criteria that you used to optimize your models?
I guess we'll speak on the clustering side first. So we want things that are kind of easily explainable, especially in like a competition type setting. We don't want anything statistically that's too fancy where we can't really explain it in an easy way. You don't never know like kind of what the statistical background of the people you might be presenting to is, especially like kind of in sports worlds where, if this were to ever be implemented in any case, like we need to be able to explain it to people who might have like no or very little statistical background. So, for clustering, things like that, we're going to do something very simple. Maybe people have heard of like k-means clustering, but essentially what you're doing is you're choosing, you think there's like k different groups of players. So in our case, we said there's 5. And essentially, you try and find a center point among all the data you have, 5 different center points, and group the players closest to those center points. So it's like a kind of very intuitive explanation. People who are close together in terms of the stats will be grouped the same place. And that's like a very intuitive explanation. As for like kind of the other modeling aspects, a lot of us are part of a sports analytics seminar with Professor Addie Weiner of the Wharton Sports Analytics and Business Institute or Initiative or something. So we talk about different statistical and analytical techniques there. And, as part of that work, we sometimes do kind of research into new sports analytics methods. So one of the research projects that we're working on right now is actually a way of kind of modeling yardage gain as a function of game state. So we applied some of those kind of research techniques that we've been using to model EPA instead of yardage gain, but it's like a very similar type of concept. And that helps at least bring some like legitimacy to the model, I think. You can probably do it in any number of arbitrary ways and get like somewhat reasonable results. But that, I guess, kind of leads into the second question, which is how do we evaluate it? So given the limited time in a competition, like we can't be so concerned about getting like the best, most tuned model. So generally we want something like, we have the idea of like reasonable results, right? So the consensus ideas of what people do, like what NFL teams do on each down and distance, they might not be the optimal thing, but our model shouldn't think that they're completely wrong, right? We want them to at least say like, on third and long, this is what most people are doing. That should at least have a somewhat reasonable result in our model. Maybe like it's a neutral result or slightly positive result. If it was a massively negative result, that probably means that something wrong with our model as opposed to something wrong with what people are doing. Simply because, like if there was something really horrible, like teams that have picked up on that and fixed it by then. And similarly, like for how we rate players, the most commonly played defenses shouldn't be rated terrible. And, all pro caliber players should not be rated as terrible in our defense, right? Like they're all pros for a reason. Even if they might not be the best, exactly all pro by our standards, they definitely shouldn't be rated as terrible. And similarly, like players who are consensus not good should also not be insanely rated by our system. So just kind of empirically looking at what does the model like give reasonable or sensible results. And that's probably the best way to go when you have limited time.
Yeah, the notion of simplicity and explainability is one of those things that we have a hard time. Like it came up in sort of the Q&A after the competition that like explainability in the sports context, and we had one of the judges, multiple judges actually who currently work for NFL teams were really harping on that like you don't need to have the best statistical technique because so many of them it's very marginal, the differences between a lot of them at a certain point. But having that explainability is like super relevant, and especially like in a competition like this, you can assume a certain level of understanding of different techniques and that sort of thing. But certainly working with a team or even just publishing to the public, like the simpler that you can come up with, and while it might not be the absolute best thing, the explainability is so important to get people to keep reading. Basically, like people will just be like, I don't get this. These are just some nerds talking to nerds, and we need to be able to communicate in a way that is more helpful to the general population without doing some kind of like talking down things. We're not, in a lot of cases, we're not professing to be like to have the absolute correct answer all the time. So you had talked about sort of using stuff that you were working on separately and sort of bringing that in. Did you do any other like research or education, whether it was football education or analytical education, sort of like in prep for or while the competition was going on?
Well, we looked at some combine data too, again, going back to just like the basic storytelling, just going back to that point of the communication and the presentation. For it being football, especially keeping that practical mindset there in terms of like, how do you have a key takeaway and then explain it to a coach that can't implement it to an actual offense or defense, was something that we really prioritize. Again, with that scenario-based football of, we want a unit of guys that can be adaptable and then also successful. So we really focused on that in terms of something that can work no matter the situation, because football is unique in that sense where you have this linear progression of downs of progress, but yet it changes drastically depending on which one you are and then at the yardage. Basketball, pretty much the same, possession to possession. Baseball, the count changes a little bit, but 1-2, 2-1, it's all kind of see-ball, hit ball. Football, it changes a lot, so we want to make sure we presented that in a clear way. And then also, how do we just have, from the fundamental standpoint, as we were talking to earlier, everyone's pretty much like a good professional athlete at the NFL level. So we're not really looking at, outliers in a sense that we have to really, model around those in any sense. It's really more, what are the key attributes that everyone's pretty decent at, and then that we can really find surplus value in.
This is kind of a tangent, but in terms of football knowledge, like where are you guys at? And like, is there a sort of difference in how knowledgeable you were about the sport among the five of you?
Well, I would say there might be a little bit of different knowledge. Personally, me and Sam here, we both play for the sprint football team here at Penn. So we have like direct intel. We play. Caleb used to play. He's taken a couple years off. But I would say everyone is definitely knowledgeable about football and knows the game. But there was probably different degrees of variation between how much like nitty gritty, different formations, stuff like that.
Did the fact that there were people who had played and people who were enthusiasts, like, did that sort of inform the way that you went about going through the project?
I would say a little bit, at least. But the thing is, I think football's a game where when people are like watching it, they're fully indulged by it. They're not just like kind of like some people watch baseball and just kind of like throw it on the background. When you watch football, you're really tuned into all the details and all the intricacies. So obviously there is a difference between playing football and watching it. But I feel like most people that watch football have a general understanding of what's going on to like a high degree.
I appreciate the compliment as a person who has never stepped on a field. I definitely represent the paradigm of nerd looking at a spreadsheet.
Question for the group in general. What would you say took the most time or the most iteration of your process throughout putting the project together?
Well, as a group, we spent a lot of time on most of our modeling. I think one of the longest, most iterated things we took into account was the clustering. We really wanted to make sure it was right. We also focused on the presentation style and deciding how best to tell our story. Football emphasis was a big reason. The importance and abilities of our defensive lines isn't broadly well known or recognized, so we wanted to make sure we represented it in a reasonable way.
So I guess I want to talk about future directions or whether it's stuff that you could have worked on and you didn't, or stuff that you might theoretically do in the future with the same data set. We asked you to answer specific questions as part of the competition, but was there stuff? So first off, was there stuff that you feel like you sort of learned more generally that wasn't specific to the questions that we were asking?
Yeah, I think we had a few key takeaways that weren't necessarily specific. I know that the competition kind of stressed figuring out what attributes make a good defensive lineman. So we kind of, as we mentioned, we really focused on size and speed for that. But I think that conclusion led us to a larger conclusion, which I think is something you're seeing not just across football, but across a lot of sports, which is that speed and kind of spreading out the game is really what's taking over. And so kind of one of our main conclusions was that as NFL offenses spread out, NFL defenses should do the same. They should, try and pick players that were faster. And as we mentioned, we used 40-yard dash data to kind of as a proxy for how fast players were. And we found that the faster players for us generally translated better in our model. And that kind of, taking from our initial thoughts of, speed is a good thing and kind of seeing that play out in our model to this larger conclusion of, trying to create a defense where all the players are fast, all the players are kind of, a lot faster than players in their own position group. And even if they're smaller, kind of realizing that might not necessarily hurt you as much as the gain you would get from the speed. It was kind of our main takeaway and something that we really learned from this project beyond what was asked in the project.
Yeah, and also to that point, probably also scenario based too. We'd probably look more at the teams that a specific team or this fictional team would be facing. Again, harping on that like practical aspect. Who are you facing? If you're facing a really good center, maybe we adjust around that. So we attack the weaknesses instead of going straight at their best player. We're not going to go up against, the Kelsey brothers if they're on the same O-line in this fictional scenario here. But, how do we best make something that's practical and usable? And sometimes that would have to adapt based on the scenario of the team would be playing against.
I guess one thing else that I really would like to bring in is the effect of tight ends and blocking. Because if you're like understanding that like the Eagles they saw that Hassan Reddick was going against tight end and they're like, let's just match this guy up against tight end and he's going to win a lot. And if you can put your players in a position to win, it's really just going to allow them to like thrive more. Like it's really interesting to see that like the way that edge players can line up off the ball and come downhill and like win on a pass rush. If you're down lineman, you have to win with power. So I used to seeing the difference between speed and power would long term could be a different implication.
I kind of want to talk generally about the value of participating in this sort of thing. I think that, we're often having conversations with people who are already, quote, in the industry. And I think that the existence of competitions like this is something that's started to exist in the last few years and has really provided an opportunity for people to get access to data that teams are using and really understand what it's like to think about the game in a way that is beyond what is publicly available, typically. So just, I guess, how is this competition, like what sort of experience are you getting in terms of being able to sort of improve the way that you're thinking about the game? Is this the kind of competition? What would you like to see in other sorts of opportunities for people who are students or just sort of like trying to get in the industry? Like how can we use this as like a springboard to other kinds of activities?
Yeah, I'll let Ezra take this. He's actually done the competition a few times now.
I was gonna ask if you guys had experience, so that's good. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so this is actually my third year in a row doing the competition, which is very interesting to kind of see how the competition's evolved over the past couple of years. This is also the third year of the competition. So kind of just, coming from, 2 years ago, I guess, or 3 years ago when everything was online and it was very Zoom heavy. Obviously all the presentations are on Zoom, but even when I was working with my team, everything was on Zoom. And then kind of seeing the evolution of how that's kind of worked over the past 3 years has been something that's really interesting. But I mean, for me, the best part about working on these projects was when I was a freshman and a sophomore, I was working with kind of other students who were a lot more experienced than I was with football analytics. And that to me was something I just learned so much from. So luckily we go to a school like Penn where sports analytics, there are a lot of students who are interested in sports analytics, who are very good at analytical backgrounds, who are able to kind of work on these projects and bring along younger students and have them do aspects of the projects which are smaller but still very valuable to kind of sit by and learn with them. So I guess answering your question about how competitions like this can be used as a springboard for the future, I think really emphasizing the ability of younger students who are interested to be able to work with people who are more experienced. So, maybe it's a competition where you have people who work in the industry direct a team or something like that, where people can really gain firsthand knowledge from more experienced, students or even people who work in the industry professionally is something that I think many people would find valuable. And also just kind of not being afraid to give it a shot. Like, even if your project doesn't turn out the best, the chance to work on something like this and the ability, the skills that you gain, even if you feel that your project isn't necessarily the best work that you could do, but kind of just taking the chance to take the opportunity to work with a data set and to make a presentation and to kind of work under a time pressure, while very stressful in the moment, is something that I found to be very valuable as I've seen my football analytics skills progress over the past 3 years.
So for future groups, what would you say would be one piece of advice you would give to them, being something that you guys think you could have done better, something you could have done a little bit more time with, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, one thing I think is, you have to understand like the time constraints. So, it's very tempting to try and build like your own value-based model. Like in this type, you get the problem like this. It says, oh, which of the players you want to pick? Like it's very tempting to try and like come up with some metric to value players like based on the like raw charted data. But, we kind of quickly realized that that's going to be a very time intensive endeavor, and we probably can't do it very well in like a short amount of time. And it's going to prevent us from being able to do like anything interesting beyond that if we wanted to pursue that. So, our whole like pass rushing and run defense was just using like a noise adjusted total points per snap. So we're taking the data that's already given to us. SIS has already done the analysis for trying to value these players, separate out their value from the other players on the field. So we're given that gift, I guess, of that free analysis done for us. So let's now kind of do something more, do something new, I guess, that's not already been done, and we probably can't do as well anyways in such a short amount of time. So that's one big thing, like really understand what data you have and what like kind of things have already been done for you versus now what are some new things that maybe haven't been done on this data set. I think a project like this, it's really maybe sometimes like easy to get caught into like the weeds of like doing some nice EDA and stuff like that, but really trying to think like what's something new that we could do, even if we can't do it really well in 1 week time, at least just trying a methodology out, getting something somewhat reasonable out there. It's not like I wouldn't say our project is anywhere close to like ready to be used in any sense, but at least it's something interesting that someone might see and can think about it further and improve on it. That's like probably more valuable than trying to reinvent the wheel of something that's already been done.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that was discussed by the judges was that we're giving you a few days to work on something, and we're giving you a limited data set. So like you have limited time and limited resources to some extent. So finding the best answer is probably unreasonable anyway, independent of trying to find the best model or whatever. Just like there's not that much time to sort of optimize your process. But in a real world circumstance, you're often not provided that much time or resources either. So like having that sort of artificial constraint does sort of mirror the real world situation of like you're only going to be afforded so many opportunities to really sit down and work on this kind of project. Like often you're bouncing around between other things. So I do think that the way that the case is structured does kind of mirror the constraints you might have in the real world, even if it's not literally the same. Other than that, I'm just really glad to have you guys on. I think that it's cool that we're part of an industry that is trying to remove some of the barriers between the sort of people who are working in the public and the people who are working in the industry. And honestly, like we're not, SIS is not one of the teams. And so we recognize that we are sort of an intermediate location between the public and the people who are working with all the biomechanical data and all that kind of stuff that are working for the team. So it's cool to see what people can come up with just a little slice of that information. I guess lastly, I'm just kind of curious what's next for you guys in terms of whether it's advancing in your career, football specific or data analytics specific. Like what are you looking to sort of get to in the future?
I really want to work in football, actually, whether it be like on team operations as like a coach side or in the front office. That's my long-term goal.
Yeah, for me personally, I think I want to work in the government, but this experience has given me a lot of valuable experience working with these great guys.
Resource constraints is something that you will understand if you're working for the government.
Exactly.
My background maybe a little bit like different. So like last summer I worked for like a sports trading firm, and I'm going back there next summer. And part of what we do a lot of is like doing models that, try and value winning and like what the percentage of chance of winning and losing before and during a game. And so like this type of analysis is not something I get to necessarily do that often, right? Where it's like more on the schematic and football side of things. So it's like a fun opportunity for me to like look at a different type of problem, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I've really thought about going into sports analytics as a career. So either kind of working for a company like SIS or even for a team, that would be something that's really cool. And kind of having these projects, again, for the third year in a row and kind of working with different teams and seeing, how different people's working styles come together and kind of different, having a lot of different prompts has really been informative to me as I kind of think about taking a step in that direction for a career path.
Career-wise, for me, I'm looking at that convergence between sports media and sports betting of how do companies like VSiN or DraftKings take a random, Tuesday night game between, say, like the Orlando Magic and like the Milwaukee Bucks and make it something interesting and an entertainment product for people to want to bet on and understand both the stats side of points per game, but then also like, hey, this guy is dating this person. Maybe he's doing a little better tonight or something like that. So combining both the entertainment value with also then the stats and backing that up and selling that to sports betting media.
I love running the gamut between all of those different things. That's cool that it's, and that also shows that, like, yes, the cool thing about working with sports stuff is that it is a hobby to most people. And so, yes, you can theoretically pursue working and focusing on that, but like there's plenty of other things that you can do in the world, and having access to some of this stuff and being able to sort of think about the game and think analytically about it is a thing that you can still do on the side, do for fun, and pursue other things. And there are so many also these not peripheral, but there's so many offshoots of the industry where you're still engaging with the sport, but you're engaging with it in very different ways. The media side, the trading side, working for a team, working working for a team as an analyst is very different than working as a coach. There's just like a lot of ways to apply that interest and those skills.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We're really glad to have you, and congratulations on winning. Congratulations to Ezra for being a multi-time winner. So, yeah, big ups. We will not be sending you some kind of like fancy trophy or anything, but you have that pride. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on, and good luck to all your all the various things that you're trying to get done in your career. So for James and Justin Stein, our producer, this has been the Off the Charts Football Podcast, and we'll see you next week.